Pottawattamie County will be deciding if they should change how members of their Board of Supervisors are elected.
6 News' Joe Harris tells us how that would work and what supporters and opponents say is on the line.
Right now, voters of Pottawattamie County, Iowa elect their Board of Supervisors at large, meaning each voter gets to vote on up to 5 candidates at a time. But a special election August 1st may change that to being based on districts. There are 3 choices. Plan 1 would keep it the way it is, elect county supervisors at large. Plan 2 would be a county-wide vote, but each candidate would have to live in 1 of 5 districts. Under Plan 3, supervisors would be elected by voters in their district.
Bringing those 5 districts in would require the 5 board members to live in the districts that they would represent.
The group Concerned Citizens of Pottawattamie County favors Plan 3. They say under the current system, Carter Lake and rural areas are underserved.
4 of the 5 members of our board live within about 10 miles of each other. It's a huge county, so we don't all live the same lives, if that makes sense. We're not all living the same reality. Some of us are farmers, some of us are landowners, some of us live in the city.
Board of Supervisors member Jeff Jorgensen says he and the rest of the board oppose any redistricting.
We were elected at large because we appeal to the voters in Pottawattamie County at large.
He says right now, any county constituent can contact any county supervisor about issues, but he says with Plan 3 redistricting, there would be 4 districts within Council Bluffs and only 1 for the rest of the county.
The 4 districts, supervisors that represent the districts of Council Bluffs are not going to be focused on county issues. They're going to be focused on those issues that affect and benefit Council Bluffs itself.
He says that would mean rural areas would be underserved, while casinos and other businesses would have a lot of influence on what their representative would do. On your side in Council Bluffs, Joe Harris, 6 News.
As for Plan 2, neither Jorgensen nor Anderson feel it would change much. Early voting's already underway. The votes will be counted August 1st.